Our next speaker is well known to regular TVI attenders. This is Brent Ziarnick. He's a graduate of the Air Force Academy and has a master's degree from Colorado State, I believe it is that right?
UC Colorado Springs.
UC Colorado Springs, and a PhD from,
New Mexico State.
New Mexico State, that's right. He's assistant professor now of comparative military studies at the Air University's Air Command and Staff College and deputy lead for the Air University's Space Horizons Initiative. He is a command space operation officer with extensive experience in global positioning system engineering, offensive space control, and theater space control. Thank you.
So thanks everybody for coming here to listen to me, and thanks for TVIW for having me. What can a guy that has a degree in economics say about the interstellar enterprise? I've done a couple of engineering classes. I've taken a couple of physics classes, but how can I contribute? Well, I can give you a whole lot of old books and pop culture references. So that's what we're going to be doing now. But I can say thank you very much to TVIW. Last night, I woke up in a cold sweat swearing that I was late for a physics final. So, that's always fun. But I'm sorry, was there a question? No? I will say one thing. I really appreciate Mark Millis. He decided that I should talk about responsible lethality, which sounds so much cooler than virtue in the interstellar enterprise. So I'll go with that. This is about responsible lethality. So I have the little slide. There it goes. So the problem that I was asked to look at by Tau Zero was, interstellar technology, regardless of what type of energy or what type of propulsion system we're going to have, requires a massive amount of energy, much more than we're used to in standard human activity. And how do we ensure that energy is not used for weapons of mass destruction or other offensive purposes? Since I'm an old Air Force guy, I was like, since I'm an Air Force guy, I was like, okay, where's the problem? But, be that as it is, I'll try to beat that, training anatomy. And so what are the potential solutions for looking at interstellar technology but not being solely focused or even mainly focused on using them for offensive purposes? And the first thing that that I looked at and I think about is, or a lot of people talk about, is moral development. Some people right now might, think, and many people do think, that humans might not be morally developed enough to have command of a large portion, large energy, large amounts of energy. We're either, we're too violent, we're too inexperienced, we're too immature, we might be prejudiced, we might be ignorant, but in the, be that as it may, we might not be like that in the future. And, the number one thing that comes to me, that vision of the future would be, Star Trek, the original series. And I love that picture because I can just imagine those guys just sitting there with a, disgusted, disappointed view of thinking about, 300 years ago, some guy like me thought I was pretty close to them, but, disappointment's fine. But moral development is something that's, at least in popular culture, a big deal. But if you really focus on popular culture now, the new iterations of Star Trek that are coming out, which are all great shows in my opinion, the Orville and then Star Trek Discovery, if any of y'all have seen it, the future is not as optimistic as it once was. Instead of sort of a morally developed humanity, we're starting to see in pop culture, divorce is still relatively common, even among our great Starfleet personnel. And then Discovery is just way off the charts. I'm not sure if y'all have seen it. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but Starfleet isn't quite as cool as it once was. And even a warmonger like myself was paused like, wow, what happened? But Seriously though, relying on moral development has some problems on a very serious level too. There's religious, some religions say that, hey, we're fallen creatures, we're probably not going to get much better, there's nothing new under the sun. And there's other philosophical issues that are around. And then you can really look at it as like, is moral development even desirable? And it depends on what kind of morality you aspire to. Are we going to something like an Immanuel Kant, federation of peoples, universal democracy, universal freedom, very much a liberal sort of understanding of moral development? Or could we go to something like Friedrich Nietzsche, which is more of a will to power? Depending on who you talk to, you have a very different type of moral, developmental state. So which one is right? Well, who knows? So can we say that, is it reliable? Should we wait to do interstellar technology or to really focus on it, instead focus on moral development, and as soon as we feel we're good enough to have this stuff, should we then go for it? Well, I don't know. It might not be reliable, it might not be slow, there's a whole bunch of different reasons. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about a more modern attempt, yet an attempt that we have a lot of historical background for, of trying to deal with the repercussions of advanced technology. And we'll just call it, nuclear technology. And bear with me for this. Let me assume that interstellar tech, just for the sake of this discussion, assume that interstellar technology is a type of nuclear technology. I even throw in lasers because Phil Lubin's in the back there. There's a lot of the same moral problems that some people might bring up for lasers, in addition to other things like we heard earlier, like fusion rockets or fission fragment. But the interesting thing that I saw when I was going through this and reading was a philosopher named Sheldon Unger, in his book from about 17 years or 25 years ago called The Rise of Nuclearism. He posited that the history of nuclear technology and nuclear politics was a dynamic oscillation between two poles. Nuclearism, which he calls sort of nuclear technology and advanced technology as the key to humanity's salvation and even moral uprightness. And then the other, pole, which would be nuclear fear, that nuclear technology is the harbinger of mankind and maybe Earth's doom. And he claimed that in the dynamic oscillation model, it wasn't, the common feeling didn't go back, wasn't sort of in the middle and sort of a small oscillation. It was wide oscillations that would hit one side to the other, to the other, to the other. And it's very interesting looking at that, because there were some people that thought the atom would be very useful, sort of in the atoms for peace idea in the Eisenhower era. And then, the no nuclear movement that we still have somewhat today. But one thing from a moral level that is actually used in environmental debates, but I think has at least a little bit of background in the nuclear debates in the 60s and 70s and 80s, is something called the Precautionary Principle. This, at least I'm going to argue, is sort of the principle behind the nuclear fear side of the dynamic oscillation. Basically, the Precautionary Principle states that if an action or something that is being developed, like a technology, has a suspected risk of being harmful to the public, if there is not a scientific consensus that there is no risk to the public, then the burden of proof for saying or for proving that it has no, it has no negative or harmful reaction actually falls on the people that are trying to do the action. So essentially, the precautionary principle is, if in doubt, don't do it. Now, there's a couple of philosophical problems with the precautionary principle that comes from both the political or moral left. Let's say the political left and the political right. And it basically says that if the precautionary principle says you should not take risks unless you know exactly what that risk entails, if they say don't do it, fall on not doing it, what about the risk of not taking a particular risk? Michael Crichton said it in one of his books from a few years back. I would say that might be the right critique. from the right, the political right critique. If you apply the precautionary principle, it contradicts itself, therefore it's not philosophically attainable. But even people on the left, like Cass Sunstein, says, hey, precaution is important, but excessive precaution might be deleterious to human progress. Now, if we assume that something similar to the precautionary principle was involved in the nuclear debates in the 60s and 70s, in nuclear fear, one interesting thing from a book by Spencer Weird called The Rise of Nuclear Fear, which really tries to, he doesn't put it in Unger's terms, but he explains the time where, we went from maybe the nuclearism, the pro-nuclear philosophical response, and swung the other way into rapid nuclear fear. He said the controversy was very obvious in the 70s regarding nuclear power in congressional testimony. Pro-nuclear power advocates normally spend, according to him, 80% of their time working on charts and data and, what we would probably consider, more logical, where the people that were against nuclear power were essentially the mirror image. 80% of their time they would talk about, rhetorical things like, phrases, slogans, cartoons, other kinds of songs. Now, when I first read that, I was like, well, that's probably very uncharitable, but Spencer Weird is actually, in my opinion, he was pretty even-handed and is sort of even more along the nuclear fear part of the continuum. But the reason I bring that up philosophically is that we'll come a little bit later, but if you go towards any extreme, you might be getting away from facts and might get into a lot of conjecture on either one of the sides. But from a nuclear perspective, and a lot of my work is sort of historical because, because quite frankly, I'm not smart enough to do anything technical with regards to the interstellar community. If you look at the precursor for really advanced space things that people were thinking about, either in the Air Force or in NASA, nuclear fear that came up in the 70s and 80s did not stop nuclear weapons. We have a whole bunch of ICBMs, and we had tens of thousands of warheads in the 60s and 70s. Thankfully, that's come down. So, in this argument, we've had the ability to destroy the world a couple times over for quite a while. But what the nuclear fear did that came up in the 70s and 80s, or the 60s, 70s, and 80s, ended a lot of sort of peaceful nuclear expressions like Orion. Most people, sorry, I've had a cold forever, but most people would assume that Orion was canceled, the nuclear pulse program Orion was canceled because it's just by itself just sort of crazy. But, and it sounds crazy, sure enough, blowing up a whole bunch of nuclear detonations in the atmosphere to launch things that are essentially light cruisers in orbit sounds way beyond the pale, even for sort of the tech-happy and nuclearist 50s and 60s. But what really killed the Orion program was political. It was I believe it was I can't remember, the 1958, I think it was in 1958, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which was intended to eliminate the use of nuclear weapons. But what really happened was that it eliminated the use of nuclear explosives for pretty much any purpose. So if we rely on, if we went towards the nuclear fear, we got the bad, ICBMs, nuclear weapons, 50 megaton bombs exploded in the atmosphere. But we really didn't get some of the positive things that nuclear technology could have advanced, like giant cruisers that could go to Saturn by 1970 or Mars or anything like that. So from one perspective, you can say that nuclear-wise, we live with the bad, a lot of the bad, in that we still have a lot of nuclear capability as far as weapons go, but we don't have anywhere near as much as the good. A lot of the fusion reactors, or the fusion rockets and fission, fragment rockets are just PowerPoint, not actual programs. There I go again. But even with the bad, we're actually not that bad at managing the bad. Everyone seems to assume that nuclear weapons are not good, and I would agree with you for the most part. But we haven't actually launched one in anger since 1945, which is pretty good. The Missileer, the U.S. Air Force Missileer, is the only kind of war-fighting person that's never actually used their weapon. So they don't get to do much but make interesting little morale patches. I'm not sure if anyone's actually copped to wearing bunny slippers in a silo, but it gets pretty cold, so there's a lot of sweats. But, so we haven't had any nuclear weapons uses. Accidents have happened, they're nuclear accidents. And this picture is especially interesting, a B-52, burning with a couple of nuclear weapons inside it. But there has always been improvement, and we're really actually pretty good at figuring out what we need to do to make sure that these accidents that still, have the possibility of happening don't become extraordinarily bad. And Scott Sagan's book, The Limits of Safety, is very, very instructive in that matter. But if we have to live with the bad, and I don't think we're going to be able to get rid of nuclear weapons, there's good reasons to have them, although you might not want them in as many, the hair trigger alerts of the Cold War, or maybe even online like they are today. But it seems like we can manage them pretty well. But how do we get the good, positive nuclear issues? And let's talk about, the classic virtue and the mean. Aristotle, in his very, very old book, Nicomachean Ethics, essentially argued that virtuous behavior is the mean between, a deficit of something and an excess of something else. So if you're looking for courage or, your amount of bravery, and excessive bravery is rashness. You're not going to, you're just reckless with your lives and other people's lives. That is not moral or virtuous. But if you don't have enough bravery, you're a coward, which is sort of universally understood as not being very moral either. But when you have just the right balance of bravery, you're what a person would call courageous. So let's try to apply the golden mean of Aristotle into Interstellar. And I would argue again that let's talk about nuclearism, nuclear fear, in a continuity of sort of the how much we enjoy or what we think about nuclear technology. So let's say that you have excess would be excessive nuclearism. Nuclear weapons are good. I've never met an explosive I didn't like. Or then something like nuclear fear being a worldwide nuclear ban now, not just of weapons, but of the technology itself. So I would argue that let's say that there's a mean that I would call nuclear discernment. And what would nuclear discernment for Interstellar be? Well, we don't really like everyone having a bomb or exploding them outside of Las Vegas. We don't think that a nuclear ban is perfectly as good as some people think. It might be bad for humanity. Let's say nuclear discernment is something that we can use nuclear technology. We like it up to the point where it allows us to start building some cool nuclear things for Interstellar. But I really like this quote by C.H. Spurgeon. I honestly have no idea who that guy is. But he said, discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It's knowing the difference between right and almost right. And right and almost right is probably going to be somewhere between the two poles of the environment, of the nuclear environment. So nuclear discernment, in my opinion, would assume that the nuclear debate is a question of actually harnessing high energy no matter where it comes from. The nuclear continuum, therefore, is just an energy question, so nuclear technology is value neutral. And just because we made weapons out of the nuclear, the nuclear technology first doesn't pollute the nuclear fusion rocket or anything like that. But reason should really dictate action in any kind of moral system by Aristotle. So reason is very easy for people like us. All of us are reasonably well educated. We can have differences of opinion, but we can talk them out, and maybe we can agree to disagree, but at least we can come up to some reasonably good consensus. But it's not always as easy to do that. But I would say that one of the ways that we could at least put an interstellar kind of approach to trying to figure out what the golden mean in nuclear technology would be from a hero of mine, a guy named Ted Taylor, the chief designer, or at least the program manager for the Orion program in the late 50s and early 60s. In his sort of semi-biography that was done by John McPhee on him, he said at the very end, every civilization has to go through this, which, he was talking about the nuclear age. Those that don't make it destroy themselves. Those that do make it wind up cavorting all over the universe. If we are able to ever, as humanity, cavort all over the universe, it's going to be because of people here, at TVIW or something similar. We are the ones that are trying to break, actually y'all are trying to be the ones that get us to cavort all over the universe. It's people like me that are in charge of making, in charge of things that could essentially destroy ourselves. We need to make sure that that kind of stuff doesn't happen. But I would suggest that a good way to having a nuclear mean via an interstellar approach would be we need to close this Taylor window as fast as we can, because we want to get through this nuclear age. And we do that by being able to cavort all over the universe without killing ourselves. And I would argue that the dynamic oscillation of the nuclear philosophy and the nuclear history, we love nuclear weapons and we want tens of thousands of them I can't stand anything that has what the last person said, the N-word in it, right? The way that we have to fight this is by eliminating the excessive precaution that maybe we have now and stop oscillating between we love it and we hate it and get right into that nice, good, mean. And if we have to oscillate between, very, very light off the center rather than to the one extreme to the other. So to wrap up, what I have to say here, I'm all in favor of Starfleet in a Star Trek future. That's great. We need as much moral development as possible, however we get there, towards something that we like better than today. But I wouldn't rely on it. And the way that we do that, or the way that we can progress maybe without the strict moral advancement, is just by trying to avoid the dynamic oscillation of energy and nuclear stuff going from worship to hatred and fear back to worship or anything like that. Avoid both excesses. Now, some people might be more aligned with one or the other, but if we stay in a nice golden mean, we can talk, we can come to some sort of reasonable consensus. Maybe one of those nice, consensuses or consensi. I'm not very good at English. If we can get the nuclear industry focused on propulsion and power and interstellar technology. Maybe some of our nuclear specialists, an interstellar researcher is not necessarily focusing on designing a brand new weapon, and that might be good around the world. And I think one of the things we need to do for, a moral imperative of interstellar technology is to try to shut this Taylor window as soon as possible. But in conclusion, the one last thought I have, my last pop culture reference to bore you all with, has anyone seen, or has everyone seen Tombstone? Does everyone remember this particular, scene in the very beginning? Well, Wyatt Earp, big time, Dodge City marshal, very, much a legend in his own time, goes to Tucson, gets off the train at Tucson, and talks to the mayor. The mayor finds him of Tucson having a little bit of a problem with crime, and asks him to be, the sheriff of Tucson. And Wyatt Earp says, "No, I'm retired." And then the mayor says, "You're going to go to Tombstone, strike it rich, huh?" Well, I'll tell you one thing. I've never seen a rich man didn't have a guilty conscience. And then what does Wyatt Earp say? "I already got a guilty conscience. Might as well have the money too. Good day now." So I would say, hey, be like Wyatt. we've already got the weapons. If you're worried about us killing ourselves, we already have the ability to kill ourselves with nuclear weapons. We might as well go out and explore the universe too. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
With possible exception of world ships and solar sails, the other interstellar propulsion methods besides nuclear also have some of the same sort of problems. As high power lasers are going to kind of generate this, what would you think, same kind of maybe resistance, and with the antimatter, they probably have the same kind of wall to get over. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think realistically, any kind of, if humankind can harness energy in any way possible, how they use that energy could be very easily turned as a weapon. Even solar power, could be used as a weapon. Ben Bova had that Power Sat book a while back. Antimatter, of course. Any science fiction game worth its salt has an antimatter bomb. Or any number of different things. So I think weapons are going to be around for a long time. I mean, even the Enterprise, which is sort of the platonic ideal of an interstellar spacecraft, could blow up a planet. We just didn't. Now, most of us right now probably wouldn't either, but it's something we should keep working on. I know a few people that might, so not me though.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you had any specific ideas on how to combat the public's hostility toward nuclear in general. You commented on how in the 70s, the anti-nuclear people spent the majority of their effort not talking about anything of balanced scientific merit, but rather on arguably propaganda. So when you say we need to have pro-nuclear propaganda just as a way to balance it out to get to that happy medium?
I would tend to say, actually, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm willing to bet that the nuclear movement, the nuclear fear movement, was actually a response to an excessive nuclearism in the very beginning. We wouldn't have had as many nuclear weapons probably as we would have had if, in the very early portion of the nuclear, the nuclear age, we didn't have, nuclear power won World War II as a bomb, and then they decided, hey, we can save a whole heck of a lot of money defending ourselves against the Soviets if we focus on, building the best nuclear bombs we could, because they're cheaper than building a lot of other, more conventional equipment. So there was a lot of nuclear adventurism out there, and because of this dynamic oscillation, even Unger didn't really understand why that actually happened. But if you start at one extreme, you tend to go to another extreme. So maybe moderation is more what we need to do, not try to overcorrect, because that is not, Aristotelian at all. But just say, hey, tell the people that, not liking nuclear, research or having nuclear programs might sound good. But the people that are, if you want Enterprise, Enterprise was a nuclear vessel too, and it's the only way that we can think of to get something similar to that. So I would stress, rationality and neutrality as much as possible.
You make an interesting point. I grew up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and actually I call myself a reformed Cold Warrior. Worked for the Air Force for a long time, and I've worked for NASA and NASA contractor for the last 20 years. We looked at a lot of nuclear propulsion concepts, and there was a point in the actually right at the time I was born that we had a choice of which way to go with our nuclear research. One had a lot of applications to nuclear power. It didn't produce as much waste. It used much smaller facilities. It was much more efficient. And there's one technology that you can produce bombs with. We went down the path of producing bombs. The facilities that we use to generate power are all designed on that technology. They support that technology. There's another nuclear technology, and you may know what I'm talking about. It's molten salt reactors, thorium-based heat fission. And I think, as far as when we go to antimatter reactions and things like that, we technologies that will lend themselves more to energy production, exploration, and there are technologies that will lend themselves more to death and destruction. And a lot of times in the early days of the nuclear industry, those were almost mutually exclusive. You can't build a bomb out of thorium.
Ultimately, what was it a moral question where they went one or the other, or was it because we were really worried about the Soviet Union? You make decisions under stress differently than you would otherwise. So maybe in a better or a different, less security focused future, maybe we can make the more economical or more peace decision next time, while still having the ability to, the option of weaponizing it if necessary. I don't know what to tell you.
One more question, please.
Just one quick comment and then a question. You mentioned earlier about the nuclear industry, about reaching out to having them work in propulsion and interstellar projects. I know that here at Marshall, and there's a good news article on it too. We've started doing that with the nuclear propulsion program here, and it's happening around the country. Especially a lot of the Navy contractors and a lot of industrial contractors are starting to reach out. And my question is, given that there's a lot of issues with classified information and sensitive information in the nuclear industry, is there a solution where we could kind of take advantage of people's concerns about proliferation by leveling the playing field somehow? Maybe if future designs were more open source, would that help with some of those concerns about making sure that nobody has the power to keep that Taylor window open?
That gets into a whole new problem of that's really political science based and other things. I've seen a couple of papers that I thought, like all the stuff on Orion, let's say, that I was able to take a look at because I've got certain clearances. Like, wow, all this stuff should be declassified. Its historical value is immeasurable. It's all neat. Until I read one of Ted Taylor's classified papers, and then oh my God, no one should read this. So I think classification has it has its utility. It just does. You can't be completely open. But the thorium-based stuff that you can't really make a weapon out of, maybe, that could be a little bit more open. That's beyond the scope of this presentation, certainly, and probably way beyond my pay grade. So, but good thought. Thanks.